The sun hung low over the dusty plains of Redstone, Texas, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the precinct parking lot. It was a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late July, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and tempers flare. Marcus Kane stepped out of a beat-up pickup truck, the engine coughing as it settled into silence. He adjusted the faded denim jacket slung over his broad shoulders, its sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms etched with faint scars from a life hard-lived. His boots, scuffed and caked with dry mud, crunched against the gravel as he surveyed the scene. To anyone watching, he looked like a drifter, maybe a mechanic down on his luck, or a ranch hand passing through. That was exactly how he wanted it. Marcus wasn't just any man. At 42, he was the newly appointed police chief of Redstone, a town teetering on the edge of chaos after years of corruption scandals and a string of unsolved cases that had eroded public trust. A black man with a chiseled jaw and eyes that carried both warmth and steel, Marcus had spent 2 decades in law enforcement, from gritty street patrols in Houston to commanding a task force that dismantled a notorious drug ring. Redstone was his latest challenge, a chance to rebuild a broken department from the inside out. But he wasn't walking in with a badge pinned to his chest or a press conference at his back. No, Marcus believed in seeing the truth unvarnished, and that meant going undercover on his first day. The precinct loomed ahead, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read Redstone PD. Officers milled about outside, some smoking cigarettes, others barking orders into radios. Their voices carried a rough edge, a mix of bravado and exhaustion. Marcus tugged the brim of his worn baseball cap lower, shielding his face as he approached. His appointment had been finalized only a week ago, and he'd insisted on keeping it quiet, no memos, no fanfare. The official announcement was scheduled for tomorrow, giving him this narrow window to observe his team without their guard up. Inside, the precinct buzzed with a chaotic rhythm. The air smelled of burnt coffee and sweat, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on chipped desks and overflowing trash cans. Marcus moved slowly, his hands in his pockets, taking it all in. Officers hunched over paperwork or traded jabs across the room, their camaraderie tinged with an undercurrent of tension. He noticed the cliques immediately, veterans in one corner, rookies hovering nervously near the coffee machine, and a few lone wolves staring at screens with grim determination. "Hey, you," a voice barked, sharp and commanding. Marcus turned to see a stocky white officer striding toward him, his uniform wrinkled and a toothpick dangling from his lips. The nameplate on his chest read, Sergeant Travis Boone. Behind him, a handful of officers paused, their eyes glinting with curiosity. "You lost, buddy," Boone said, his tone dripping with mockery. He stopped a few feet away, sizing Marcus up with a sneer. "This ain't a soup kitchen. Keep moving." Marcus kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of the room shifting, attention turning toward the confrontation. "Just looking for the restroom," he said, his voice low and steady. Boone snorted, stepping closer. "Restroom? What, you think this is a damn hotel?" He turned to his audience, grinning. "Hear that, boys? Guys looking for the spa treatment." Laughter erupted, harsh and grating, as a few officers slapped their desks in amusement. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd faced worse, far worse, than a loudmouth with a badge. But before he could respond, Boone leaned in, his breath hot with tobacco. "You don't belong here, pal. Take your sorry ass back to wherever you crawled from." Then, with a flick of his head, he spat, a thick gob landing square on Marcus's cheek. The room went still for a heartbeat, the laughter dying into an awkward silence. Marcus felt the warm drip slide down his face, his jaw tightening. Every eye was on him now, waiting for a reaction. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled bandana, and wiped the spit away with deliberate calm. "That how you treat everyone who walks in here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Boone smirked, unfazed. Only the ones who stink up the place. Now get out before I drag you out. Marcus met his gaze, holding it for a long moment. The sergeant's arrogance was palpable, but so was the unease rippling through the onlookers. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked toward the hallway, his boots echoing against the tile. Behind him, the laughter resumed, though it sounded forced now, tinged with uncertainty. He didn't head for the exit. Instead, he slipped into a side corridor, pulling out his phone to check the time. The briefing was in 15 minutes, his moment to step out of the shadows. As he leaned against the wall, he replayed the encounter in his mind. Boone wasn't just a bad apple, he was a symptom of something deeper, a rot that had taken root in Redstone PD. Marcus had come here to burn it out, and he'd start today. The intercom crackled overhead, all personnel to the briefing room, now. Marcus straightened, tucking the bandana back into his pocket. It was time to light the fuse. The briefing room was a cavern of chipped paint and mismatched chairs, packed with officers jostling for space. The air buzzed with restless energy as Marcus slipped in through a side door, a manila folder tucked under his arm. He'd ditched the cap, letting his close-cropped hair and sharp features stand out under the flickering lights. No one noticed him at first, their attention was fixed on Captain Elena Ortiz, a wiry woman with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense scowl, who stood at the front barking for quiet. "Settle down, people," Ortiz snapped, her voice slicing through the chatter. "We've got business to handle, and I'm not here to babysit." Marcus lingered near the wall, scanning the room. Boone lounged near the back, his arms crossed and that same smug grin plastered on his face. The officers who'd laughed earlier flanked him, their postures relaxed but their eyes darting nervously. Marcus felt a flicker of anticipation. They had no idea what was coming. Ortiz cleared her throat, her tone softening slightly. "As you know, Chief Hargrove stepped down last month after that mess with the mayor's office. We've been running on fumes since. But today, we've got a new chief stepping in, a man with a hell of a record and a plan to get us back on track." A murmur rippled through the crowd, curiosity piqued. Boone leaned forward, whispering something to the officer beside him, who snickered. Marcus stepped forward, his movements deliberate, and the room began to hush as heads turned. He reached the podium, setting the folder down with a soft thud, and faced the sea of badges and uniforms. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice deep and steady. "My name is Marcus Kane. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." The silence was electric, a collective intake of breath as recognition dawned. Boone's grin vanished, his face paling as if he'd been sucker-punched. The officers around him froze, their eyes widening in disbelief. Whispers erupted, then died just as quickly under Marcus's unflinching gaze. "I came here this afternoon in plain clothes," Marcus continued, his tone measured but firm. "Not to play games, but to see this department for what it is, not what it pretends to be when the brass is watching. And what I saw was a disgrace." He let the words hang, watching the room squirm. Boone shifted in his seat, his hands clenching into fists. Marcus's eyes locked onto him briefly before sweeping the crowd again. "In my 20 years on the force, I've seen good cops and bad ones. I've seen departments rise and fall. But I've never seen a place so comfortable with disrespect, not just to civilians, but to the badge itself." A few officers dropped their gazes, guilt flickering across their faces. Others stared ahead, jaws tight. Marcus stepped closer to the edge of the podium, his presence filling the room. "Less than an hour ago, I walked in here as a stranger. No uniform, no title. And one of your own spat in my face because he thought I didn't matter. You laughed because you thought it was funny. But it's not funny. It's a symptom of everything that's rotting this precinct from the inside." Boone's face flushed crimson, his eyes darting to the floor. Marcus didn't call him out by name, not yet. Instead, he raised a hand, silencing the growing murmurs. I'm not here to point fingers or play the blame game. I'm here to fix this. But let's be clear, the culture of bullying, prejudice, and laziness stops today. Respect isn't a suggestion, it's a requirement. For each other, for the people we serve, for the oath we took. He paused, letting the weight settle. I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just out there, he gestured toward the window, but in here, where it starts. Redstone's lost its way, and I'm not naive enough to think I can snap my fingers and change it overnight. But I can promise you this, I'll hold every single one of you accountable. Step up, and we'll rebuild together. Step out of line, and you're gone. The room was a mausoleum of silence, every officer pinned under his words. Marcus nodded to Ortiz, who stepped forward, her expression unreadable. Effective immediately, he said, Sergeant Travis Boone is suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct. This isn't punishment, it's a wake-up call. Gasps broke the quiet, Boone's head snapping up in shock. Chief, he stammered, but Marcus cut him off with a look that could have stopped a train. You didn't know who I was, Marcus said, his voice low and cutting. That's the problem. You didn't care. And that's why this department's bleeding trust. He turned back to the room. Meeting's over. Get back to work. Officers filed out, their usual bravado replaced by a heavy stillness. Boone stormed past, his face a mask of fury and shame. Marcus watched him go, then headed to his office, the folder still in hand. The real fight was just beginning. The next 2 weeks in Redstone PD were a slow burn of change. Marcus's presence was a constant spark, igniting tension and unease among the ranks. His office door stayed open, a silent invitation for anyone brave enough to step inside. Most didn't. The precinct hummed with a new rhythm, quieter, more cautious. Officers who once strutted with unchecked swagger now kept their heads down, their laughter replaced by clipped conversations. Marcus didn't let the silence fool him. He knew trust wasn't built in a day, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. Boone's suspension had sent shockwaves, but it wasn't enough. The rot ran deep, tangled in years of favoritism and unchecked power. Every morning, he walked the halls, greeting officers by name, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. He pored over personnel files at night, unearthing patterns, complaints buried, incidents swept under rugs. Boone wasn't an outlier, he was a product. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Officer Lila Carter knocked on his door. She was a rookie, barely 25, with sharp eyes and a nervous energy that belied her quiet voice. Chief Kane. Got a minute? Marcus waved her in, setting aside a stack of reports. What's on your mind, Carter? She hesitated, twisting her hands. I've been here 6 months. I've seen things, heard things. What happened with Boone, it's not new. It's just louder now because it was you. He leaned back, studying her. Go on. Lila took a breath. There's a group, Boone's crew. They run things off the books. Intimidation, cutting corners. I kept quiet because I didn't want to be the snitch. But after your speech, I can't anymore. I want to be part of something better. Marcus nodded, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. You're not snitching, Carter. You're stepping up. Tell me everything. She did. Names, dates, incidents, a web of misconduct stretching back years. Marcus listened, his jaw tightening with every word. When she finished, he stood, offering her a rare smile. You've got guts, Carter. That's a start. We'll handle this together. The next day, he called a closed-door meeting with Ortiz and a handful of senior officers he'd pegged as potential allies. Armed with Lila's intel and his own findings, he laid out a plan, a top-down audit of every officer, every case, every complaint. "We're not just cleaning house," he said. "We're rebuilding it." The audit hit like a thunderclap. Within a week, 3 officers resigned rather than face scrutiny. 2 more were suspended alongside Boone, their records a mess of falsified reports and witness coercion. The precinct buzzed with whispers, but Marcus kept moving, his focus unrelenting. He started community outreach, open forums where residents could voice their grievances. The stories poured in: harassment, neglect, fear. Each one fueled his resolve. Boone's investigation wrapped up on a Friday. Marcus sat across from him in a stark interrogation room, the sergeant's defiance replaced by a sullen glare. "You're done here," Marcus said, sliding a termination letter across the table. "Not because you spat on me, but because you spat on everything this job stands for." Boone sneered. "You think you're some hero? This town'll chew you up." "Maybe," Marcus replied, unfazed. "But it won't be because I didn't fight for it." Boone stormed out, and Marcus leaned back, exhaling. The precinct was shifting, slowly, painfully, but it was shifting. Lila and a few others had started shadowing him, eager to learn. The old guard grumbled, but some were coming around, their cynicism giving way to cautious respect. Marcus knew the road ahead was long, but for the first time, he felt the ground steady beneath him. 3 months later, Redstone PD bore the scars of transformation. The precinct walls were freshly painted, a small but symbolic change funded by a community fundraiser Marcus had spearheaded. Complaint logs were digitized, transparency reports posted online. Arrests were up, but so was public approval. Slowly, grudgingly, the tide was turning. Marcus stood at the podium during a town hall, facing a packed room of residents, officers, and reporters. His denim jacket was gone, replaced by a crisp uniform that gleamed under the lights. "We're not perfect," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "But we're trying. That's more than we could say a year ago." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others still skeptical. A woman in the front row stood, her voice trembling. "My son was harassed by your officers last year. How do I know it won't happen again?" Marcus met her gaze. "You don't, not yet. Trust takes time. But I promise you, every officer here knows what's at stake. We're accountable now, to you." She sat, unconvinced but listening. It was enough for Marcus. After the meeting, Lila approached him, a shy smile on her face. "Chief, we got the stats back. Crime's down 12% since you started. People are noticing." He clapped her shoulder. "That's not me, Carter. That's us." Later, in his office, Marcus stared at a framed photo on his desk, him and his father, a beat cop who died in the line of duty when Marcus was 10. "Hope I'm making you proud, Dad," he muttered, tracing the frame. His father's lessons, integrity, grit, compassion, had carried him here, through the spit and the sneers to this fragile victory. The precinct wasn't fixed, not by a long shot. Pockets of resistance lingered, and the scars of the past wouldn't fade overnight. But as Marcus walked the halls that night, nodding to officers who now met his eye, he felt something ignite, a fire within, steady and unyielding. Redstone was his crucible, and he'd forged something new in its heat. The story wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like a beginning.